Welcome back to ThinkTech. This is Keeping the World Company. I'm Jay Fidell. We have a special guest today, Shackley Raffetto, former chief judge of the Second Circuit, and a fellow who's been involved with the Marine Corps and the Navy pretty much all his life. He's a fourth striper in the Navy Reserve, retired. Welcome to the show, Shackley.
Glad to be here, Jay.
And Tim Apicella, co-host, and this is a very important discussion. Welcome, Tim.
Good morning.
So let's talk about Prigozhin. Let's talk about what happened last weekend. Quite remarkable. And what was also remarkable is the reaction of the Russian people who stood aside and Putin, who left town. So let's see. Tim, why don't you tell us what happened?
Well, it's a long, winding road to what happened to last week, and the road begins with the competition of massive egos, narcissists, dictators, those type of personalities, and Prigozhin is one of them. He's a sick puppy. Certainly, probably would be guilty of many war crimes against humanity. But what really occurred is, he's complaining that he's not getting ammunition from the Russians, and that it's making him look bad, and his troops were sustaining mass casualties as a result of lack of ammunition and support. And then this grew into more criticism that Putin was trying to dissolve the Wagner group by making them sign pledges to the Russian army. So he saw that as the attempt to disband his private mercenary group. And then add to that, I don't know if it's true or not, but he alleged that Russian Air Force came in and wiped out a lot of his troops, and that was the final straw for him. And he said he wanted to conduct a march to Russia, to Moscow, to resolve this grievance. And that march to Moscow became very serious and was perceived as an insurrection, a coup d'état. And it had to be stopped. The problem was that no one was stopping it. And I think Vladimir Putin, and rightly so, figured, hey, there's no one to really stop them from coming into Russia, and I better do something quick. And I think there went a phone call, most likely to Levashenko, the leader of Belarus, saying, do something quick. And you had a convenience, if you will, an armistice that the march to Moscow would stop, and Wagner groups would disband, and that's where we are right now. I think that it won't take long for Putin to renege on his word. He's already starting to say that we're going to investigate again what happened here and whether or not they're traitors to Russia or not. And I think no matter what he said initially about giving carte blanche immunity to him, I think he's going to go back on his word on that.
So this has profound effect, no matter how you look at it. And Tim Snyder's piece this morning was an interesting analysis of the profound effect, how this shows the flaws and the corruption. It's kind of a world of corruption in Russia, of lies and deceptions and treachery in Russia. And our friend Putin has not only allowed it, he's created it for how many, 20 years plus. And so when you have this kind of internecine fighting, you have profound possibilities for the fragmentation, the undermining of the entire Russian enterprise. How far down that track are we, Shackley?
Well, I think it's good to think about it this way. Bill Browder, the man who did business in Russia for a long time and was behind the Magnitsky Law that got passed because that was his lawyer who was killed by the regime. He says you have to understand it's a mafia state. And so if you look at it that way, this is just a repositioning of the various capos and dons within the mafia state. I'll add a couple of things, though. For those who don't know, Prigozhin was a convicted criminal. He did something like 8 years in Russian prison. He got out. He was up in St. Petersburg, and somehow he got the money to start a high-end restaurant, probably through the Russian mafia. And then he became a friend of Vladimir Putin's, and through that friendship, he became the caterer for the Russian army. Putin actually was on TV yesterday, I think it was, number one, saying that he bankrolled Wagner, the Russian state did, which makes the Russian state and him responsible for what Wagner has done around the world and in Ukraine. And then he gave for the catering business, he got another €1 billion, I guess, €1 billion each. And Wagner was one of the major players involved in vicious atrocities in Syria, in the Syrian war, there in Mali, Central African Republic, and in Libya, at least. And one commentator put it this way: he said, down there they're a consultancy for autocrats, and for helping keep those people in power, they get mining concessions for diamonds and things like that. So there's a lot of money involved in this, and it's all flowing back to Prigozhin, and he's splitting that with Vladimir Vladimirovich, and that money is important to a lot of people there. And what's interesting, though, also is that when Prigozhin decided to move on the establishment after he said some. I never could understand how he could get away with all the things he was saying that was so negative about Minister of Defense Shoigu and General Gerasimov, the head of the Russian military, and actually said this whole war is a big mistake, and said it quite publicly. Then he moved into Rostov, and apparently General Shoigu and also Gerasimov were present in Rostov at the time, and apparently, I mean, the implication is he was trying to get him, trying to corner him. But anyway, he just drove in there; nobody stopped him, and apparently Shoigu took off on his helicopter, and Gerasimov was in a safe house, and so he didn't have access to them, and that's when he decided to go north. To try to go towards Moscow. And on the way, he shot down an IL-22 command and control airplane. That's like a US AWACS. They only have like 12 of those things. And he also shot down 5 or 6 Russian helicopters, including some Ka-52s, which are their Cobra gunship type aircraft. So it's pretty extraordinary. And then they just make this deal, completely extra legal, if you think about it, because he's killed all these Russian pilots, for one thing. What happens? I mean, who's going to be responsible for that? So then he makes this deal that Shoigu can go off to Belarus, and with his millions? I understand that they have arrested some of the Wagner people in Africa. The other Russian representatives, their police representatives, I guess. So it seems to me it's more of some sort of settlement of grudges and internal power structure movement than anything else.
Yeah, the latest is that a couple of the generals in the Russian army have disappeared. They haven't been seen since the weekend, and the question is, what does this mean that they disappeared? It could mean that they've been assassinated, and it could mean they're being interrogated right now as we speak.
Yeah, the word is that's General Surovikin,
Mhm.
and he was the deputy head of the actual war effort for the Russian military in Ukraine. He used to be the head of it, and then he was demoted to deputy head, but he was still the head of the Air Force. It's a pretty high-ranking guy, and he allegedly has been arrested and has been incommunicado for 2 days.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be him right now because the allegation, and I'm not sure where it came from. It could have been an inside allegation or an outside allegation, back into Russia, back into Putin. was that he was somehow helping Prigozhin, siding with Prigozhin.
And as evidence, they're using the fact that he had a personal registration number with the Wagner group. That's what they're using as partial evidence that he was involved. But they're denying that he's in captivity. He just flat out deny that they are holding him.
Oh, the lies are flying left and right, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
So, Shackley, what do you think about the role of Lukashenko, Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus? I mean, he's been a clear puppet, and he really doesn't get along with Putin. He just follows Putin around like a puppy dog. And why in the world does he have the clout from a third country to negotiate a peace between two warring factions in another country, in Russia? Or is that all she buy?
I think it should buy. I mean, you're right. I mean, he's only in command in Belarus because of Putin's support during the last election. There was this very strong democratic movement, the leader which is now in exile and speaking out.
We've talked to him. We've had him on our show.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Well, I think he was just a shill. He was just somebody brought in to, as a part of the kabuki that they were putting together. But because you can't imagine that they want Prigozhin and all of the Wagner fighters in Belarus. How's that going to help Lukashenko? I mean, these guys, a lot of these guys are prisoners, or they're very battle-hardened, brutal people who have committed all kinds of atrocities in Ukraine. He wants those people exercising authority in his country. That's hard to believe. And I think what's going to happen is Prigozhin is going to fall out of a window, air quotes, and a lot of the people who run the Wagner organization are going to disappear.
I think it's already started. I mean, it's interesting that Putin would make a deal on Saturday and publicize it around Russia and the world and break it almost immediately. If I had to go back and retitle the show today, I would say, "Is anybody safe?" Uh, and that includes all sides of it. So, Tim, is anybody safe here?
Well, the big question is safety when you have a vassal state of the Kremlin, Belarus, now harboring their nukes. So, yeah, it's a very good question for the title of this show. Is anyone safe? People aren't happy. Belarusians are not happy that they've become, a satellite state of the Kremlin, and they're very upset about it. And they have good reason to be, because if there is an outbreak or an expansion of the war, most likely it'll come from Belarus. Belarus already allowed the Russians to, border and harbor on their country when they attacked Kiev. And other examples, now they're harboring nukes. So they most likely will be drawn into a war if it expands. And the Belarusians are quite upset. So no one is safe.
What does it mean that they're not safe? If we say that Prigozhin is not safe, and I agree, Shackley, he's not safe, and his lieutenants are not safe, and some of the people, in the Russian army and in the Kremlin are not safe, where does that take us? We're going to have some real heavy action by Putin, and to get rid of these people. And then, of course, is Putin safe? There are people who don't like him, and somehow those statements you referred to from Prigozhin have unloosed a lot of people, and they're wondering whether Putin has been lying to them. I'm not saying everybody. There's still people affected by his ongoing propaganda, but I don't think Russian is as monolithic as it used to be, and I don't think the Russian army is as monolithic and affected by the propaganda as it used to be. And before you answer, I want to play a short video that I got this morning of a I guess, a junior officer in the Russian army who is going public on what happened to his unit. So let's look at that now.
Okay.
Бригады «Шторм», точнее, короче, роты. Изначально у нас было 150 человек, мы прибыли в зону СВО. После ожесточительных боев, после всего, что мы увидели, вот остатки пацанов, что остались. Среди нас 2 200-х. Нас сегодня привезли с передовой вот в эти апартаменты. Все в интернете видели это видео, это место.
Здесь полковник ФСБ угрожал мобилизованным, которые
Здесь
оказались...
полковник ФСБ угрожал мобилизованным. Ну, мы «Шторм» как бы. И сейчас мы здесь отдохнули ровно 3 часа после дороги с передка. Где? На передке, где мы были. Нам не поставлялась БК. Нам не поставлялись ни вода, ни продукты питания. Не вывозились 300-е. До сих пор там гниют 200-е. Их никто просто не забирает. Отдаются ужасные приказы, которые, в принципе, даже не стоило бы выполнять. Вообще, мы вообще считаем, что нас просто обнуляют. Вот это лично вот мое мнение пацанов, у нас вот было 150 человек. Да, вот наш остаток из 150. 3 месяца мы служим, нам ни разу не заплатили зарплату. Сейчас к нам приехали и сказали: пацаны, надо ехать в приют, наверное, передок опять, в мясорубку, где мы уже были. И мы от этого не вернем. Суть этого обращения такова. Мы, записав это обращение, разошлем их и это обращение своим родственникам. После чего мы отказываемся дальше идти выполнять боевые задачи по вот этим, по ряду причин, которые мы обратились в обращении. И сдаемся в руки ВП. Пусть, если кто-то из нас, из этого остатка, фамилии мы позже перечислим, кто-то погибнет. Они погибли не на передовых, просто обнулили. Кто-то может там, я не знаю за что, но мы вот они стоим, вот они, мы с передка, все ребята здесь. Гибнет, он погиб не на передке, его просто
There's no way we can verify whether that's true, what he's saying is true. That's just floating around the web. I think the essential point of showing it is that he is sending that to the Russian people. And that small group, the remaining group behind him, is sending it to the Russian people, right or wrong. And that is the kind of thing. And he's not the only one who's making statements like that. And there are other videos around showing surrenders by the Russian army to the Ukrainians. And so I guess my question to you, Shackley, is what effect does all of this have when people in the army are sending statements back to the families and the homeland as against the propaganda they were getting before?
Well, this may be a bit optimistic, but I've always felt that one of the likely ways that this war ends is that the Russian army collapses, as it did after World War I. And that's the end. And there's so much we've seen how much corruption there is, and what effect that corruption has had on the fighting capabilities of the Russian military. And now we're seeing this incoherent behavior by the leader of the nation, and that certainly can't make the soldiers feel any more that they're led by competent leaders, and with their generals being arrested and these Wagner people fighting with them, and sometimes getting better treatment, I guess, and receiving more money for sure. I don't see how that can go on forever.
Well, let me take it a step further with you. Let's say it keeps going and we have more of this. I have to reconcile the fact that he blew up a restaurant in a shopping center a day or two after this remarkable insurrection. And I think Putin is just trying to show that he's still in charge, and he got his Air Force to do that. By the way, just a footnote is that there was a guy, a Ukrainian, who phoned in information about Ukrainian officers in that restaurant, and he has been arrested by the Ukrainians. In any event, Putin is trying to show that he's still in charge. At the end of the day, however, I believe, and I'm interested in your view of this. I believe that everything we have talked about, Prigozhin's, remarks and speeches and statements about Shoigu and others in the Russian military, have gotten to the people. They've gotten out there. His taking over Rostov, it got out there. His march on Moscow and his shooting down helicopters and the AWACS plane, it got out there. And Putin, of course, can try his propaganda, but I think they all know that he flew away from Moscow and pre-recorded a speech before he went. What a chicken! And I think it got out there. So all of this information, including the surrenders of Russian troops in the battlefield, and remarks like you know that officer who spoke on the video, those things are getting out. And you say that the Russian military could collapse. My question to you, Shackley, is what does that mean in terms of Russia? What does that mean in terms of Putin? Is Putin still in charge when the Russian military collapses? Can he recover here? Or is this all going downhill for him? And if so, what's the scenario?
Well, uh, it's, who knows really, but my thinking is that he after watching his speeches, he's going to engage in some real purging of the military. And you have guys like Surovikin, who has a terrible reputation as a vicious person, but he's considered very effective militarily. Whereas apparently Shoigu and Gerasimov never had any real military combat experience. They were administrators or something. So if he goes around purging the effective leadership of the military, that's going to be similar to what Stalin did in the 30s, and was one of the reasons why the Germans made such fast progress when they attacked the Soviet Union. And that's going to destabilize him even more. And, as I say, it's mafia state, right? So people are going to start wondering whether they need a new leader to carry this thing off, or just to preserve their privileges that they have, because it's all about privileges, right?
How does that play out in a repressive state where there's plenty of room in Lubyanka prison?
Probably a lot of assassinations and arrests and imprisonments and people going to the gulag. And, they're not going to give up easy, right? And they've got authority. So they'll exercise that authority until it doesn't work anymore. And as they say, dictatorships last until they don't last. And often are suddenly over.
Well, we're on the road potentially. So Tim, it's more than just Putin and Prigozhin. It's more than just the Wagner group and the Russian army. It's Ukraine. How is this going to affect Ukraine? This is a really important question, because they're still in a war. There are still Russian troops there. The Russian army never pulled out. Okay, although the Wagner group pulled out of Ukraine, the Russian army did not. They're still there. They're still fighting. They're still blowing up restaurants and killing 11 people at a time and more. So my question to you is, how do you think this affects the war?
Well, I had hopes that Ukraine would have taken advantage of the 25,000 troops withdrawal from Ukraine, that somehow on a military basis that could have been taken advantage of. But I guess part of the problem was, from what I understand, is Ukraine was left in the dark about this leading up to this event. And I'm sure that Zelensky is probably not too pleased that information may or may not have been shared with them, so that they could have taken full advantage of it. But how does it affect the war? Well, you just saw it on the video. Your military, if they're demoralized, they've lost the will to fight. And that's like a virus. That starts to spread rapidly. And that's not a good thing for the existing Russian troops that don't want to be there probably in the first place. Now they really don't want to be there. So what's their will to fight? Probably for survival, but not the quest of Ukraine.
Yeah. How about Europe in general? How do you think it may change the attitude of the various countries in NATO, Germany especially, who are the point on Western Europe's assistance to Ukraine?
Well, again, it's who's in charge of the country, who's in charge of Russia, and remember, they hold more nukes than any other country. So NATO's concerned, the United States concerned, the world should be concerned. Pro, Prigozhin, what wild card he is. What if he had successfully taken to Moscow and somehow had a coup d'état? Would you want that psychotic leader to have access to the nukes? I'd say not.
Shackley, a lot of people, their first reaction is to celebrate the fact that Putin has been undermined this way and his power has been questioned. At the same time, there's a possibility, as we have discussed, of instability, and instability is problematic. The Wagner group is not dead. There were satellite pictures of construction going on almost immediately after this happened in Belarus. I don't know who's constructing what, but Tim's point is, they do have nuclear weapons there. And the other point is that Lukashenko may not be as strong as we think. He may not have the support of the Belarusian people. So, the instability is not necessarily something to celebrate, because when it comes down to it, Putin may do things that are irrational now.
Well, my understanding is that the tactical nuclear weapons that were sent over to Belarus are under Russian control, and for what that's worth. But you have to remember back to what you're saying. After the end of the Soviet Union, we ginned up a huge program. I actually know a fellow who was involved in it, and sent experts over to the former Soviet Union to assist them in securing their nuclear arsenal, because we were worried at that time, for the same reason, that that some of those nuclear weapons would get in the wrong hands, and now you have Mr. Putin is working closely with the Iranians, which worries me a little bit from that point of view.
Yeah.
And so no, but I don't think that'll happen. I think it'll just be somebody else comes along. Maybe Medvedev will come back. All the oligarchs will back him, because there's election next year, right? Some people were saying the reason that Putin was out in Dagestan or wherever he was, shaking people's hands, I guess yesterday, that's the beginning of his political campaign to try to get reelected next year. Which is probably a sure thing, unless these oligarchs decide otherwise.
Well, he created the oligarchs, but they're not, as we know, they're not necessarily loyal and faithful to him at this point in time. And remember, too, that one of the first rules of propaganda is distract people from the truth. You lie and you distract. We have seen that, and we have seen Putin do it on a regular basis.
Hey, Jay, I'd like to jump in on one thing.
Yeah.
We did see images of Putin pressing the flesh in campaign style. I'm not so certain that was a direct result of the pending election. I think Putin knows he looks really bad fleeing Russia, and cowardly maneuver, if you will. And I think this is one way of him, because remember, Putin is a germaphobe. And I'm sure pressing the flesh is not something he really desired to do, but it was certainly a campaign PR move to reinstall that he's popular amongst the Russian people.
Yeah, and those in Russia who remember the Great Patriotic War, and that's a central historical event, of course, for the Russian people, remember that Stalin didn't leave Moscow when the Germans.
Good point.
They got awfully close to the Kremlin.
Good point.
Yeah. His flying off to his dacha near St. Petersburg was really a bad move. I think this changes the calculus. I mean, even if he's able to restore support from the oligarchs, even if he's able to restore a semblance of order by doing clever purges, the reality is other countries looking in on him have a different view of him. China, for example. I think it changes the calculus for his position in the world. Do you agree, Shackley?
Yes, I do. And you can see the change in the Chinese position too. Now they're looking like they're distancing themselves from what's going on, and who knows? Maybe it'll dissuade them from doing anything with Taiwan. I think they're very smart and they look very closely at this stuff, and I would think they're having second thoughts.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, Tim, what about the United States? What about Tony Blinken and Joe Biden? How does it change the calculus for us? And what considerations are there for the State Department and the Biden administration? How should we see this, and what should we do about it?
Well, if I was the Biden administration, I would send up the flares that we will work with Russia when they have a stable leader, and when Russia is exited completely out of Ukraine. So those messages should be put out right now to undermine Putin.
Mm,
That's the big next question, right? Is whether the West is going to put pressure on Ukraine to settle for giving up the Donbass and Crimea. That'll be very interesting to see. I think the inclination is going to be to do that, to look at Korea and say, well, if we just have a ceasefire and a demilitarized zone and we put a bunch of UN soldiers in there, that'll work great. But they haven't looked at history. The only countries, if you think about it, the only countries that we've been to war with that actually changed into democracies were Japan and Germany, and we destroyed them and never left.
Yeah, you can't include Italy in that necessarily.
That's good.
Okay, I think we're almost out of time, you guys. Tim, could you give us your summary, your final thoughts on this?
My final thoughts is I agree with Shackley is that there's going to be a purge, and I think it'll be rather severe. Like all purges, they try to be as quiet as possible. But remember, purges rarely contain within the boundaries of their target. Purges sometimes expand beyond the target. And I think there will be a lot of oligarchs that may be somewhat involved in this event that took place, and the purge will expand. And that's really what you see when dictatorships fall, is that a sense of paranoia takes place. And those that had nothing to do with the event become accused of having something to do with the event. And I think that oligarchs will start saying, hey, I could be next, and we got to stop this.
Yeah, and maybe it's different than things of similar nature in the past, in the sense that these events we've been talking about are known around the world, and probably to a large degree they're known around Russia. So the reaction could be different than what we might expect, and who knows where it goes. It's hard to predict, and I know it's maybe impossible to predict. But Shackley, what are your final thoughts about that?
I'm like Alice in Wonderland. What does she say? It's curiouser and curiouser.
Very good.
I'm just waiting to see what happens next. I'm glued to the internet to see what's going to happen. I mean, it's so unprecedented. It's really hard to figure. I just figure Prigozhin's done for, and all of his lieutenants are done for, and we'll just see how far it goes.
Yeah, it was definitely something that changed the world. We just don't know how. Well, thank you, Shackley. Shackley Raffetto, retired chief judge of the Second Circuit in Maui, and a fellow who has traveled around and had plenty of contact with the military. He's a senior officer in the Navy Reserve right now. And Tim Apicella, our co-host, who follows these things on a daily basis, right?
Sure.
Thank you both. Aloha.
Aloha.
Thanks so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please click on the like and subscribe buttons on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And please check out our website. That's thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.